The camera focuses on a stack of unpaid bills. Their red past due stamps faded, but still carrying the heavy ghost of desperation, scattered across a scarred wooden kitchen table. The dust dances against the slanted Texas sunlight pouring through a small, silent attic window, illuminating those ancient papers that once threatened to break a family apart. The only sound is the distant, steady hum of an air conditioning unit fighting the brutal July heat and the dry rustle of aged leather. Norma Strait sits on the floor of this quiet sanctuary, surrounded by cardboard moving boxes and heavy leather-bound scrapbooks. Her hands, stained with the fine white dust of the Texas hill country, gently touch the remnants of a life built on grit, faith, and endless miles of highway. The air up here is thick, carrying the unmistakable scent of dried mesquite, old paper, and the quiet dignity of a history that survived the hardest of times. She reaches for a massive black case, pushed deep into the shadows of the eaves. It is covered in deep scratches and peeling stickers from long-forgotten roadside bars and dusty honky-tonks. The heavy brass latches are oxidized, green with age and stubborn from decades of disuse. As she forces them open, they yield with a sharp snap that echoes through the attic. She lifts the lid. The smell of aged cedar, dried sweat, and rusted steel strings instantly fills the room, a sensory time machine dragging her back to the late 70s and early 80s. Resting inside the velvet lining is the old Martin Dreadnought acoustic guitar. It is not just an instrument. It is a wooden vessel that carried a man through the darkest valleys of his life. Norma lifts the heavy guitar by the neck. As she tilts it to inspect the heavy grain of the wood, a strange, hollow scratching sound echoes from deep inside the sound hole. It is a dry, papery whisper against the inner braces of the wood. Frowning, she tilts the guitar further. The sound moves again. Reaching into a nearby box of sewing supplies, she pulls out a long metal knitting needle and carefully guides it through the rusted steel strings, fishing blindly in the dark belly of the guitar. After a few agonizing moments of careful maneuvering, she catches the edge of something. A folded piece of paper, brittle and yellowed with age, slips through the sound hole and flutters down, landing softly in her lap. The paper is heavily creased, stained with ancient sweat and the unmistakable grime of a working man's hands. She turns it over. On the back, written in a shaky, exhausted handwriting that she immediately recognizes as belonging to a very young George Strait, are just a few words. For Norma, in case the lights go out for good. The visual shock does not come from the paper itself, but from the sudden, earth-shattering realization that the most stoic, unbreakable, and reserved man in country music history has kept a ghost bottled inside the wood of his first guitar for his entire life. The setting shifts slightly in her mind as she stares at the paper, the memories flooding the quiet room. Outside the heavy oak walls of the Strait family ranch house near San Antonio, the brutal Texas sun distorts the horizon over the dry earth. Miles away on the sprawling property, George, the perfect archetype of the American cowboy, sits tall in the saddle of his quarter horse. He is mending a broken wire fence under the scorching heat, a man of profound silence and deep Christian faith, who has always preferred the blistering reality of hard physical labor to the blinding glare of the spotlight. He is a man who believes in providing, in protecting, and in carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders without ever letting his knees buckle. He is miles away, unaware that the vault of his greatest insecurity has just been broken open. Inside the quiet, cologne-scented office where Norma has brought the guitar, the silence feels heavy enough to crush her. She unfolds the fragile paper. The letterhead belongs to a cheap, run-down roadside motel in New Mexico. The date scribbled at the top is a Tuesday night in 1981. It was the darkest, most suffocating period of their lives. It was a time when the bills piled up on the kitchen table, exactly like the ones she was just looking at, when the money barely covered the gas in the tank of their battered pickup truck, and when hope felt like a cruel, punishing joke meant to break their spirits. As Norma reads the faded ink, the narrative plunges deep into the raw, unvarnished agony of the past. The handwriting reveals a man standing on the absolute edge of collapse. The tone of the letter is incredibly heavy, soaked in the profound guilt of a traditional provider who believes with every fiber of his being that he has failed his family. George writes about the deafening noise of the cheap bars, the suffocating smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke, and the miserable, insulting paychecks that were slowly stealing her youth away. He writes about the long, dark drives back home, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, praying to God for a sign, for a breakthrough, or for the strength to walk away. He details the crushing shame of walking through their front door after a long tour, looking into Norma's eyes and seeing unwavering support when he felt he only deserved contempt for dragging her down a dusty road of empty illusions. He writes about the cold nights staring at the ceiling, doing the math in his head, realizing that his dreams of playing music were starving the family he swore before God to protect. The words are not poetic. They are the bleeding wounds of a proud Texas man who feels less than human because he cannot put enough food on the table. The lowest point of the letter hits Norma like a physical blow to the chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. The ink is smudged, perhaps by a drop of sweat or a solitary hidden tear from a man who never cried. George writes, "I am putting this guitar away tonight, Norma. I am burying it. My pride is not worth your tears. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to drive down and ask for a steady job working cattle at the Reynolds Ranch. I love you too much to keep being a failure." The raw, unfiltered pain of reading those words destroys Norma. She falls to her knees on the Persian rug, clutching the brittle paper to her chest, her shoulders shaking with heavy, silent sobs. She does not cry because of the poverty they endured back then. She cries because of the sudden, devastating realization of the crushing, solitary weight her husband carried entirely by himself. He used to smile at her every morning, pouring her coffee and tipping his hat, acting like everything was going to be fine, while inside he was tearing himself to pieces. The invulnerable image of the stoic cowboy dissolves into the tear-stained ink on the motel stationery. He had been willing to sacrifice the very core of his soul, his music, simply to ensure she had a roof over her head. If you have ever had to hide your own pain to protect the people you love, or if you admire the silent, unyielding strength that holds a family together through the darkest storms, subscribe to the channel right now. Discover how the absolute weakest moment of the King of Country became the unbreakable foundation of his crown. Norma remains on the floor, the dust motes settling around her like snow. The smell of the cedar from the open guitar case seems to wrap around her, a reminder of the countless nights he sat on the edge of their bed, calloused fingers flying over the steel strings, trying to write a song that would finally pay the rent. She remembers the times he would come home with bruised knuckles from loading heavy amplifiers into the back of the truck in the freezing rain, never uttering a single word of complaint. He simply washed his hands, sat at the table, and bowed his head in prayer, thanking God for what little they had. The letter in her hands is a testament to a breed of men that seems to be vanishing from the earth. Men who do not broadcast their struggles. Men who view their own suffering as a necessary toll to pay for the safety of their household. George had written his own musical obituary in that motel room. He had drafted a resignation letter to his own dreams because his duty as a husband and a provider outweighed his desire to be an artist. As she traces the faded blue ink of his signature at the bottom of the page, the sound of a heavy diesel engine rumbling up the gravel driveway breaks the silence of the afternoon. The crunch of thick tires on the dry Texas dirt signals that the ranch work is done for the day. A truck door slams shut, echoing across the vast, empty landscape. Heavy footsteps, accompanied by the distinct metallic jingle of silver spurs, begin to walk across the wooden porch. Norma tries to wipe her face, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She tries to fold the brittle paper back into its original creases, but her fingers refuse to cooperate. The scent of dust, horses, and leather grows stronger as the heavy front door of the house opens and closes. The slow, rhythmic thud of cowboy boots on the hardwood floor moves down the hallway, drawing closer to the office. Every step sounds like a hammer striking an anvil, a steady march of a man who has spent his entire life facing the wind without blinking. She looks at the open guitar case, then down at the letter. She realizes that for over 40 years, every time George took that Martin guitar out to play in the early days, every time he strummed a chord, this letter of surrender was rattling inside the wood. He had carried his own letter of defeat with him to every gig, to every smoky bar, to every radio station that turned him away. The footsteps stop right outside the heavy oak door of the office. The brass doorknob slowly begins to turn. Norma holds her breath, the yellowed motel paper clutched tightly in her hands, as the door groans open, revealing the towering silhouette of the man who had secretly carried the weight of the world inside a wooden box. The heavy oak door of the office groans on its brass hinges, a sound that shatters the fragile, dust-filled silence of the room. The blinding Texas afternoon sun spills into the hallway behind him, casting a long, imposing shadow across the polished hardwood floor. George stands in the threshold. He is a portrait of a life spent pushing against the unforgiving elements of the earth. His faded blue jeans are coated in a thick layer of white limestone dust from the pastures. His chambray shirt clings to his shoulders, darkened with the sweat of a man who has been driving fence posts into the hard, sun-baked clay since dawn. He instinctively reaches up, his calloused, dirt-stained fingers gripping the brim of his worn straw cowboy hat, pulling it from his head as he steps out of the blinding light and into the cool, shadowed sanctuary of his home. The air in the room is thick, heavy with the scent of dried cedar, old paper, and the sudden suffocating weight of an unearthed secret. George lets his eyes adjust to the dimness. He takes a deep breath, expecting to ask his wife what she wants for dinner or to mention a stray calf he found near the creek, but the words die in his throat. His gaze drops to the floor. The U-Haul boxes are pushed aside. The heavy leather scrapbooks are scattered. And there, resting in the center of the Persian rug, is the battered black case of the old Martin Dreadnought guitar. It lies open, its velvet interior exposed like an open wound. His eyes slowly trace the length of the room until they find Norma. She is sitting on the floor, her knees pulled tight, her face pale and streaked with tears that have cut clean lines through the faint layer of attic dust on her cheeks. Her hands are shaking violently. Between her trembling fingers, she holds the yellowed, brittle piece of motel stationery. The faded blue ink of a desperate, defeated young man screams from the page, bridging a gap of over 4 decades in a single, heart-stopping second. For a man whose entire life has been defined by an unbreakable stoicism, whose public image is built on a foundation of quiet, unshakable strength, this is the moment the armor cracks. The instinct of any proud Texas rancher, any man who has spent his life swallowing his own pain to keep his family fed, would be to turn away. The natural urge is to change the subject, to walk out the door, to grab the paper and throw it into the fireplace, letting the flames consume the evidence of his darkest hour. But George does not retreat. He is a man of profound faith, a man who knows that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually demands to be brought into the light. He steps fully into the room. The rhythmic, heavy thud of his leather boots, accompanied by the sharp metallic jingle of his silver spurs, echoes off the wood-paneled walls. Every step feels like a march across a battlefield of memories. He walks slowly, deliberately, leaving a faint trail of pasture dust on the rug. He stops right in front of her. The smell of the open fields, of raw earth, horses, and honest sweat washes over Norma, mixing with the dry, ancient scent of the guitar case. George looks down at the letter. He recognizes the jagged tear at the top of the page. He remembers the cheap, flickering neon sign outside the window of that New Mexico motel room in 1981. He remembers the suffocating heat, the smell of stale cigarette smoke embedded in the cheap mattress, and the crushing, absolute certainty that he was a failure. He remembers the exact moment he decided to give up his music to save his family. Slowly, the towering cowboy lowers himself to the floor. His worn denim jeans stretch tight and his knees pop loudly, a harsh reminder of decades spent in the saddle and on endless concert stages. He kneels directly in front of his wife, the woman who has stood by him through empty bank accounts, broken down trucks, and the blinding, terrifying storm of global fame. He does not try to hide his face. He does not try to mask the profound vulnerability that is suddenly swelling in his chest. He reaches out. His hands, thick, scarred, and permanently calloused from steel guitar strings and barbed wire, gently touch the edge of the fragile, yellowed paper. His fingers brush against Norma's trembling hands. The silence stretches, pulling tight like a wire about to snap. When he finally speaks, his voice is incredibly low, a gravelly, resonant baritone that carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. I thought the strings had turned that to dust a long time ago." The words hang in the air, heavy and raw. Norma looks up at him, her vision blurred by a fresh wave of tears. She sees the deep lines etched around his eyes, the grey in his hair, the physical evidence of a lifetime of hard work. But in this singular moment, she does not see the legendary king of country music. She sees the terrified, desperate young husband who thought he was dragging her down into a life of poverty and broken promises. Her voice breaks as she finally speaks, the words tearing out of her throat. She asks him why. She demands to know why he hid this burden from her. Why did he carry the agonizing weight of that failure entirely by himself? She points to the words on the page, her finger trembling over the sentence where he promised to bury his guitar and beg for a job at the Reynolds Ranch. She tells him that a marriage is a partnership, a vow taken before God to share the heavy loads, not a solitary march into the darkness. She weeps as she tells him how much it hurts to know that he was smiling at her over cheap diner coffee every morning, tipping his hat and telling her everything would be fine, while his soul was bleeding out in secret. George listens in absolute silence. He does not interrupt. He lets her pour out the pain, the shock, and the profound sorrow of discovering his hidden agony. He looks at the tears falling onto his dusty boots. When she finally stops, gasping for air, the room falls dead silent again, save for the distant hum of the air conditioner. He looks her dead in the eyes. His gaze is piercing, steady, and filled with a fierce, protective conviction. He explains the logic of a man raised on the harsh, unforgiving plains of South Texas. He tells her that a real man, a man who takes a vow to protect and provide, does not take the heavy, miserable weight of his own saddle and throw it onto the back of his partner. He speaks of duty, of the sacred responsibility he felt to shield her from the brutal reality of his own doubts. He points a calloused finger at the faded motel letterhead. He tells her about that specific night in 1981. The band had played to an almost empty room. The owner of the bar had shortchanged them, handing over a few crumpled bills that barely covered the cost of the diesel fuel needed to get home. George describes sitting on the edge of that sagging motel bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, feeling a profound, sickening wave of shame wash over him. He felt he was robbing her of a decent life, of a home with a white picket fence, of the security and peace she deserved. He wrote that letter with tears in his eyes, fully intending to hand it to her the moment he walked through their front door, fully intending to surrender his soul to the grueling, anonymous life of a ranch hand, just to ensure she never had to worry about a grocery bill again. But then the narrative shifts, and the raw emotion in the room begins to transform into something infinitely more powerful. George leans closer, his voice dropping to a fierce, intense whisper. He tells her that he did not hide the letter out of shame. He did not shove it into the dark belly of the Martin guitar because he was too cowardly to face her. He explains the morning after he wrote that note of surrender. He had driven all night, fighting sleep, fighting the urge to pull over and scream into the empty desert sky. When he finally arrived at their small, drafty, rented house, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale, cold light through the kitchen window. He walked into their bedroom. He saw Norma sleeping wrapped in a worn quilt, breathing softly, entirely trusting him with her future. He tells her that in that exact moment, looking at her resting face, a sudden, violent wave of determination washed over him. He realized that quitting was the easy way out. Giving up his God-given talent to dig fence post holes for the rest of his life was not a sacrifice, it was a surrender. And a Texas cowboy does not surrender. He walked back out to the kitchen, grabbed the letter of defeat, and folded it tight. He picked up his guitar, but instead of throwing the paper in the trash, he pushed it through the sound hole. He shoved it deep into the dark, hollow wooden chamber of the instrument. Norma stares at him, her breath catching in her throat, the tears freezing on her cheeks as she listens to the revelation. George reaches out and places his large, heavy hands over hers, pressing the fragile paper between their palms. He tells her that the guitar was never meant to be the coffin for his dreams. It was the cage for his fears. He put that letter inside the wood so that every single time he sat on a stage, every time he played a smoky honky-tonk, every time he faced a hostile crowd or a skeptical record executive, his fears would be trapped right beneath his hands. His voice gains a sudden, overwhelming strength, vibrating with the power of a man who has conquered his own demons. He tells her that every time he struck those steel strings, every time he pounded out a rhythm, his fingers were physically beating his own doubts into submission. The vibration of the wood was him fighting the urge to quit. He made a quiet, desperate vow to God and to himself that he would not stop playing until the vibration of the music literally turned that letter of defeat into dust. He looks at the battered black guitar case, then back into Norma's eyes. A slow, deeply emotional smile touches the corners of his mouth, softening the rugged lines of his face. He tells her that she was the reason he kept striking those strings. She was the anchor that kept him from drowning in his own insecurity. He played so hard, drove so many miles, and fought so relentlessly to build a life for them that he eventually forgot the letter was even in there. The fear had been entirely consumed by the work, by the music, and by his absolute devotion to honoring the woman who chose to walk down that dusty, uncertain road by his side. The heavy, suffocating tension in the office completely dissolves, replaced by an overwhelming tidal wave of relief, understanding, and profound respect. The letter between them is no longer a symbol of imminent failure or hidden agony. It is the ultimate trophy of a silent, brutal war they won together. It is the physical proof of a man who took his absolute lowest moment, his deepest, darkest terror of failing as a provider, and locked it away, using it as the raw fuel to build an empire of steel strings and honest words. Norma lets go of the paper. It flutters softly to the Persian rug, forgotten. She reaches forward, her hands covered in attic dust, and pulls the legendary stoic cowboy into a fierce, desperate embrace. She buries her face in the crook of his neck, breathing in the scent of the Texas dirt, the sweat of his labor, and the undeniable truth of his character. He wraps his massive arms around her, holding her tight against his chest, closing his eyes as the weight of 40 years of unspoken sacrifice finally lifts from his shoulders, evaporating into the warm afternoon air. The golden hour of the Texas hill country begins to bleed through the window of the quiet ranch office, casting long, deep, amber rays across the dusty hardwood floor. The sunlight catches the millions of tiny dust motes suspended in the air, making them look like floating embers in the heavy, emotional silence of the room. George holds Norma tight against his chest, his massive, calloused hands resting gently against her back. The scent of the open pastures, the dry limestone dust, and the honest, bitter sweat of a long day of labor radiates from his work clothes, grounding her in the absolute reality of the man she married. He is not a polished celebrity in this room. He is a weary, devoted rancher who just laid his heaviest, most guarded burden at the feet of the woman he swore before God to protect. Slowly, the towering cowboy pulls back just enough to look at her face. He reaches up with a rough, dirt-stained thumb and gently wipes a tear from her cheek, his touch surprisingly light for hands that spend their days stretching barbed wire and breaking wild horses. He looks down at the Persian rug. The yellowed, brittle piece of motel stationery lies there, entirely forgotten, its faded blue ink no longer holding any power over them. The ghost of 1981, the suffocating terror of poverty and failure, has been dragged out of the dark belly of the guitar and completely incinerated by the light of the truth. George lets out a long, heavy breath, a sigh that seems to carry 40 years of unspoken tension out of his lungs. He turns his gaze to the battered black case resting on the floor. He slowly reaches out and grips the thick mahogany neck of the old Martin dreadnought. He lifts it from its velvet bed. The instrument is heavy, scarred, and bruised. The varnished wood is chipped around the edges from countless collisions with cheap microphone stands and the cramped walls of dive bar stages. The brass frets are tarnished, and the steel strings are dark with age and rust. It is a beautiful, battered survivor, a wooden reflection of the man holding it. Without saying a word, George shifts his weight and settles down cross-legged right there on the floor, sitting among the scattered U-Haul boxes, the old leather scrapbooks, and the dust of their shared history. He rests the heavy body of the guitar against his knee. His thick, scarred fingers instinctively find their places on the fretboard, pressing down on the rusted steel. He reaches up to the headstock with his right hand and begins to turn the stiff, oxidized tuning pegs, the sharp metallic creak of the old gears turning echoes in the quiet room. He plucks the low E string. The sound is flat, dull, and heavy. He turns the peg, adjusting the tension, feeling the vibration travel through the wood and into his chest. He tunes the A string, then the D, his ear perfectly catching the pitch despite the years of deafening stadium monitors and screaming crowds. As he brings the instrument back to life, the rich, intoxicating smell of aged cedar and rosewood wafts up from the sound hole, filling the space between them. Norma sits across from him on the rug, her hands resting in her lap, watching the man she loves with a profound, overwhelming sense of awe. She watches the way his hands move over the wood, recognizing the familiar, comforting rhythm that has been the soundtrack of her entire adult life. George strikes a full G chord. The sound explodes from the old Martin, rich, warm, and incredibly resonant, vibrating the floorboards beneath them. The guitar has not lost its voice. It has only been waiting for the hands of its master to command it to speak again. He begins to fingerpick, a slow, deliberate, and deeply soulful rhythm. He does not need a microphone. He does not need a backing band. He does not need the blinding lights or the adoration of the masses. Right now, in this dusty, sunlit office, he is playing for the only audience that has ever truly mattered to him. He closes his eyes, his head bowing slightly over the instrument, and he begins to sing. The opening lines of Amarillo by Morning fill the room. His voice is a force of nature, gravelly, deep, and aged like fine oak barrel whiskey. It carries the undeniable weight of a life well lived, a voice forged in the fires of endless highways, cheap motels, and relentless perseverance. As he sings the familiar words, the lyrics take on a completely new, devastatingly beautiful meaning for Norma. When he sings about having nothing but what he is wearing, about losing everything he had, the words are no longer just a story about a rodeo cowboy down on his luck. They are a raw, intimate confession of the exact moment he almost lost his mind in that New Mexico motel room. But as the song swells, as his fingers dance across the rusted steel strings, the melody transforms into an absolute anthem of victory. He is singing about survival. He is singing about the stubborn, unbreakable Texas grit that forced him to fold that letter, shove it into the dark, and ride out the storm. He finishes the song, letting the final resonant chord ring out in the quiet room until the vibration slowly fades into absolute silence. He opens his eyes and looks at Norma. A quiet, deeply peaceful smile touches his lips. The heavy, invisible armor he has worn for decades is gone. The vault is empty. The fear is dead. The narrative seamlessly shifts, leaving the quiet, golden warmth of the ranch office and plunging straight into the electric, deafening, chaotic atmosphere of a massive Texas night. The smell of dry dust and cedar is instantly replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of pyrotechnics, spilled beer, hot stadium lights, and the undeniable, crackling electricity of 100,000 human beings breathing as one. The visual is staggering. AT&T Stadium in Arlington is packed to the absolute rafters. It is an ocean of cowboy hats, pearl snapshirts, and leather boots, a massive congregation of working-class people who have come to pay their respects to a living legend. The roar of the crowd is not just a sound, it is a physical, terrifying force that vibrates the concrete pillars of the massive structure and shakes the air in the lungs of everyone present. The stage is a sprawling, multi-level masterpiece of steel and blinding LED screens, positioned right in the center of the stadium floor. The heat from the massive lighting rigs beats down relentlessly. And standing exactly in the center of it all, bathed in a brilliant, blinding column of pure white light, is George Strait. He is dressed in his immaculate signature style, a starched, perfectly pressed button-down shirt, crisp blue jeans that fall perfectly over his polished leather boots, and a pristine black felt cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. He is the undisputed king, holding court in his massive steel castle. Slung over his shoulder is a gleaming, custom-made acoustic guitar. The stage lights catch the high-gloss finish of the wood and the brilliant chrome of the tuning pegs, flashing like lightning every time he moves. Behind him, his legendary ace-in-the-hole band is locked in, a tight-knit brotherhood of musicians who have ridden the same long, dusty roads he has. The pedal steel guitar weeps in the background, a haunting, beautiful wail that cuts right through the roar of the massive crowd. The fiddle player soars away with furious, joyful energy. The rhythm section lays down a heartbeat so heavy and steady it feels like a freight train rolling across the Texas plains. It is the absolute climax of the night, the final encore. The crowd knows what is coming, and their screaming reaches a fever pitch, a deafening wall of pure, unadulterated adoration. George strums a heavy, driving chord, letting the sound wash over the stadium, feeling the massive energy of the people feeding back into him. But before he steps up to the silver microphone to deliver the final vocal, before he unleashes the song that will send 100,000 people out into the warm Texas night, he does something completely unexpected. He stops playing. He lets the band carry the heavy rhythm. He turns away from the microphone stand. He steps out of the blinding center spotlight and begins to walk slowly toward the stage left wing. The massive crowd watches in awe as he moves, his heavy boots walking with the same slow, deliberate, unshakable rhythm he uses to walk his pastures back home. The follow spot operator scrambles to keep the light on him, cutting a bright path through the hazy, smoke-filled air of the stadium. He walks all the way to the absolute edge of the stage, stopping just inches from the sheer drop-off into the dark abyss of the backstage area. Away from the flashing cameras, away from the screaming fans, hidden deep in the heavy shadows of the stage wings, stands a solitary figure. It is Norma. She is standing perfectly still amidst the chaos of running roadies, coiled cables, and heavy equipment cases. She looks graceful, steadfast, and incredibly calm, an anchor of absolute peace in the middle of a screaming hurricane. She is wearing a simple, elegant blouse, her eyes fixed entirely on the towering cowboy walking toward her. She is smiling. It is a quiet, deeply knowing smile that completely cuts through the deafening noise of the stadium. George stops at the edge of the stage. He looks down into the shadows. The roar of the 100,000 people behind him slowly fades into a dull, distant hum in his mind. The blinding lights, the massive screens, the platinum records, and the staggering weight of his own legacy completely vanish. In this singular, suspended moment in time, the massive stadium shrinks down to the size of a small, dusty attic office. It shrinks down to the size of a freezing, drafty rental house in 1981. It is just the two of them, standing on the edge of the world, exactly as they have always been. He looks her dead in the eyes, his face completely serious, stripped of all the performance and the showmanship. He reaches up with his right hand. He does not wave, he does not point. With a slow, deliberate, and incredibly heavy motion, he curls his thick, scarred fingers into a fist. He brings his hand down and taps his calloused knuckles twice against the solid, gleaming wood of his custom guitar, right above the dark, hollow opening of the sound hole. Tap, tap. It is a secret language, a silent, profoundly intimate acknowledgement exchanged across the boundary of light and shadow. It is a message delivered straight from his soul to hers. He is telling her that he remembers. He is telling her that the cage is still locked. He is telling her that the terrifying, crippling fear of failure that once drove him to the edge of despair has been permanently conquered, beaten into submission by decades of relentless devotion. He is telling her that he is still playing for her, that every single note he strikes in this massive stadium is a testament to the morning he looked at her sleeping face and decided to fight the world rather than surrender. Norma sees the gesture. Her smile widens and a single tear of pure, overwhelming pride escapes her eye, catching the stray beam of a stage light before falling into the shadows. She nods her head, a slow, graceful dip of her chin, accepting the silent tribute from the man who built an empire to keep her safe. George turns back around. He adjusts the strap of his guitar, settling the heavy wood against his chest. He walks back to the center of the massive stage, stepping back into the blinding, white-hot column of the spotlight. The crowd screams louder, realizing he is back at the microphone. He grabs the neck of the guitar, his hands gripping the instrument with the absolute, unbreakable authority of a man who knows exactly who he is and exactly what he has survived. He strikes the strings with a massive, sweeping motion. The final song erupts through the stadium sound system, a massive, joyful explosion of traditional country music that shakes the very foundation of the building. The king of country music stands tall, his voice ringing out clear and true, a voice that refused to be silenced by poverty, by doubt, or by the crushing weight of his own insecurities. The true measure of a working man, the absolute core of his respect and his legacy, does not come from the money he makes, the titles he is given, or the crowds that scream his name. It does not come from a false bravado or a pretense that he is immune to the terrifying storms of life. The true, undeniable strength of a cowboy is born in the dark. It is forged in the agonizing moments of crushing vulnerability when the weight of the world threatens to break his back and shatter his spirit. It is the profound, quiet wisdom to look at his own deepest fears, to hold his own failures in his hands, and instead of letting them destroy him, to lock them away in a wooden box. It is the raw, unyielding grit to use that fear as an anvil, striking it over and over again with calloused hands until a masterpiece is forged from the pain. A real man does not lack fear. He simply swallows it, saddles up his horse, and rides straight into the blinding dust of the storm, entirely out of a sacred, unbreakable devotion to the woman who looked at his empty hands and chose to walk the long, hard road by his side anyway.